when you were confronted with several facts of women being oppressed in the past, that you say, well, that's an awful story to tell young men. This really gets to you. Why is
Everybody's
that so?
bloody oppressed in the past. Jesus, human history is a complete catastrophic nightmare. The more you read it, the more horrified you become. It's like the vast majority of people killed in wars are men. The vast majority of people who are killed in dangerous jobs are men. It's not like either of us had an easy time. I mean, the huge problem for women prior to the 20th century was death in childbirth. At least we got that under control. You know, and you could say, well, women didn't have all the rights that men had for quite a substantial amount of time, but it wasn't like most men had rights. Christ, what percentage of Eastern Europeans were serfs until 1850? The vast majority of people in the feudal ages were essentially slaves. The men didn't have any rights.
The Scandinavians seem to have figured it out with cheap childcare or even state-funded childcare, and also a paternal leave that's divided.
And what's their birth rate?
Well, but why is that so important, the birth rate? Because it's.
Well, I don't
something
know.
all
What's
rich
so
societies
important? I mean, that's part of the question. Well, what's important? Well, children are important, and one isn't enough.
No?
First of all, we don't even know if children can be raised on their own. I mean, how? We don't know. So.
Now, we do see that the Scandinavian countries, and I don't include Holland in that, people tend to include Holland,
Yeah.
but I don't think we are a Scandinavian country, that they score highest on happiness, so they must do something right.
Well, they're rich.
But there are also other rich countries, but then...
Yes,
they
and
are
most
still
of the rich
happy.
countries score quite high on happiness. The Scandinavians do particularly well, but the difference between them and the Canadians and the Americans and so forth isn't that great. I mean, they are actually quite staggeringly rich, especially the Norwegians, since they have all their oil money. And so there's multiple.
I mean, they're rich. Everyone buys into the culture, and the populations are significantly smaller than America.
Reasons why their societies are stable. They're also homogenous countries in the large, which also seems to be something that contributes to the stability of communities, according to the work of Robert Putnam from Harvard. And they're small countries, and they're relatively easy to govern.
But I'm just trying to find out, do you or do you not think that gender equality is also something that leads to happiness, that makes couples happier?
Well, it depends on what you mean by equality.
What? It probably factors in, but those that he just listed are clearly the more important factors. Cultural homogeneity, wealth, and small population.
Well,
You know, if you mean, well, the equality is a very complicated word because people use it to signify equality of outcome, which I think is absolutely an appalling concept, or they use it to signify equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity means set your society up so those who have the talent have the untrammeled ability to express it. Well, great. Anyone with any sense, even if they were greedy, would agree with that. I mean, if you're talented, let's say you're a great musician. Well, I'd just as soon you had the chance to show that because maybe I could listen to your music. You know, you have to be a fool not to be in favor of equality of opportunity. Talent is in short supply, and we need to encourage it wherever we can possibly discover it, independent of race, creed, and color, and gender, and all of those things.
What he just described is this very dangerous concept that people seem to have a problem with nowadays called merit. Actually earning your position. That seems to be like something people hate that now. That you earn what you have. They don't like that.
But then to equate that with equality of outcome and to say that, well, because there are differences in, let's say, the sex representation by sex at different strata of different organizations, that's a consequence of some sort of fundamental sociological oppression is an entirely different argument, as well as being different than the argument that all of the outcomes should in fact be the same if the society was equal, because there's no evidence that men and women given free choice will choose the same outcomes. And why would they? I mean, look, here's a question. Diversity, inclusivity, equity. The triumvirate, right? The modern triumvirate. Equity is equality of outcome. Okay, let's talk about diversity. Are people different or not? Well, if they're diverse and diversity is worth pursuing, then people are different. Or they're not. It's one or the other. So if they're diverse, they're different. Well, if they're different, if you let them manifest their diversity, you're not going to get equality of outcome. It's so incoherent that it defies comprehension. It's like if people were the same, well, then you get equality of outcome. And if they were the same, then you wouldn't have to worry about diversity. But if they're different, importantly different, culturally or biologically, whatever the reasons you happen to come up with, and you leave them be, they're going to pursue their individual, idiosyncratic, diverse interests, and that's going to produce an entire plethora of unequal outcomes. And in fact, we mostly work for unequal outcomes.
That people can't seem to understand this basic truth that he laid out is crazy to me. A basic course in just logic and critical thinking would solve 99% of the problems we face in society. Because when you investigate these ideas that these people hold, they break apart. They don't hold to any level of scrutiny. They don't at all. You just need to investigate it. And then it's like, okay, this is nonsense. This is pure nonsense.
You know, I mean, you have a career, you picked a specific career. You don't expect to be absolutely equal with everyone else on every single parameter because you specialized in something and you're hoping that you can develop some expertise that ratchets you up a competence hierarchy so that you're good for something and so that you have some opportunities. And that's all associated with unequal outcomes as well. And there's supposed to be something bad about that? It's like it's what we're striving for. It doesn't mean that people are happy when they walk down the street and see a homeless person lying there, you know, half frozen to death and alcoholic in their sleeping bag. No one wants that. But those problems are very difficult to solve. You think, well, it's an economic problem. It's like, not usually. It's usually a mental illness problem, or it's an addiction problem, or most commonly, it's an alcoholism problem. And throwing money at that is not going to help. So, you know, we have these hyper simplified solutions for problems that are so complex that fools leap in where angels fear to tread. And we associate poverty with lack of money. And that's both the conservatives and the liberals do that. And it's the height of hypersimplification because people's problems are far more complicated than their mere economic difficulties.
Now again, we have to separate a few things because I'm going to get some water. Because every time you're touching upon a lot of different things. So it's also difficult for me to choose what I'm reacting to.
No problem.
So I heard you say this before, that this, when you were confronted with several facts of women being oppressed in the past, that you say, well, that's an awful story to tell young men. This really gets to you. Why
well,
is
everybody's
that so?
bloody oppressed in the past. Jesus, human history is a complete catastrophic nightmare. The more you read it, the more horrified you become. It's like the vast majority of people killed in wars are men. The vast majority of people who are killed in dangerous jobs are men. It's not like either of us had an easy time. I mean, the huge problem for women prior to the 20th century was death in childbirth. At least we got that under control. You know, and you could say, well, women didn't have all the rights that men had for quite a substantial amount of time, but it wasn't like most men had rights. Christ, what percentage of Eastern Europeans were serfs until 1850? The vast majority of people in the feudal ages were essentially slaves. The men didn't have any rights. Most men didn't get the vote until very late. And, you know, women got it afterwards, but not that many decades afterwards. And to construe the history of the human race as the pervasive oppression of women by men it's a story invented by women who have never had a satisfactory relationship with a single man in their entire life. Not a brother, not a father, not a husband, not a son, nothing. Because if they had a satisfactory relationship, they would not be driving that narrative forward.
You read?
That 100% facts. Couldn't have said it better myself. 1000%. This cartoonish viewpoint of history where men are these evil, oppressive, controlling rulers, and women are just being completely taken advantage of with no agency is just so disingenuous. That somehow all men were having a grand old time oppressing women is disingenuous. Most men had a very horrible time because a small elite group of men and women maintained power throughout history. All men have to answer for that.
Really do believe that?
I absolutely. Why would I not believe it? What's the counter evidence?
Well, the counter evidence are all those facts that women
What
used
facts?
to have less rights, like
Yeah, but so
voting, but also
yes, but
owning
you're
property.
looking at tiny periods of history. You
Tiny.
know, for the vast majority of human history, most people were slaves, men and women. There were very few free people. And then in the West, for since the Enlightenment, a small and increasingly large percentage of men started to develop a certain amount of freedom. And that spread very rapidly over the period of over a minimum number of hundreds of years. It spread, I think, as fast as it possibly could have, given all of the things that have to happen in order for that kind of equality to manifest itself. And we don't even know what the preconditions are for that equality. You can walk down the street in Holland safely. No.
There will
Compared
be
to most
catcalling,
places in the world, you can walk down the streets in Holland safely.
That should let you know, like, the fact that she's disagreeing. The fact that she's disagreeing should let you know that she's in clown world. She's delusional.
Most of the places in the world, you can't walk down the streets safely. Well, how long does it take to establish a society that's civilized and sophisticated enough so that one of the primary hallmarks of your freedom would be the ability merely to walk somewhere unaccompanied?
You say we should be thankful. Women should be thankful.
I didn't say women should be thankful. I said people should be thankful that we've managed these things and that we've freed so many people in such a short time. You know, the social constructionists, their view of history is 300 years long, if that. Usually it's more like a decade. You look at this over any reasonable period of time, that freedom is spread among people so rapidly, especially in the last 500 years, that it's an absolute bloody miracle. You know, most men didn't have the vote 150 years ago. So we're looking at very small periods of time. And the proclivity for freedom to spread and for equality to spread is very, very powerful. And there's virtually no one opposing it. You know, I mean, in the span of a single lifetime, it seems like things are progressing rather slowly, but from a cultural perspective, the rate of change is so fast that that we can barely keep up with it. And I don't believe for a moment that the typical woman has fewer opportunities now than the typical man. I don't see that that's true at all. I don't think the facts support I certainly don't think the facts support that that's true. Women are outperforming men at every level of the economic hierarchy. You know, they don't do as well economically once they graduate, but that's partly because of the majors they determine to take and because of the choices they make with regards to their career strategies. So this narrative of oppression it's so resentful and so ungrateful and so unrealistic and so historically ignorant that it's a miracle to me that people can swallow it. Human history is simple. Things were terrible before 1895. Terrible. The average person in the West lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, which is half the current rate that the UN regards as abject poverty. And yet we read backwards and we say, well, men were privileged. Which bloody men were privileged? Exactly. I mean, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Who were privileged? The serfs who tilled the land? The knights who defended the feudal communities? The kings, perhaps, although I'm not so sure you would have wanted to live in a drafty and freezing castle with no plumbing or electricity or heating or entertainment through ice-cold winters with the constant threat of war. The men went off to war constantly. endless numbers of devastating plagues. No one had enough to eat. It's like, and then what are we doing? We're quibbling about whether men or women had a rougher time. It's like, Jesus, you know. And then what? There was no cooperation between men and women? What's that? Men help raise children. Do you know how rare that is in the mammalian community? It's almost unheard of. And they actually do a pretty good job. Most men love their children. And so where's the oppression?
It's classic Jordan Peterson, man. It's a classic Jordan Peterson. Just absolute flames. He just absolutely destroyed her argument. Like, this narrative of oppression of the history of men and women is cartoonish. It's clown world level stuff. And he speaks about the resentfulness that a lot of these people have. They sit there and bicker over the past and develop a resentment for something they never went through and for something they don't even understand. You sit on your high horse, you're fed these proverbial grapes of privilege in society, and then you complain about how you're underprivileged. You have a person who's living in the Western world in an advanced country talking about how they're not privileged because of what people went through hundreds of years ago. But that's the video. Let me know if you guys want to see part 2, but make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.